recording. Hello, I'm Rachel, event manager for Northshire Bookstore with store locations in Saratoga Springs, New York and Manchester Center, Vermont. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Before we get started, a few quick notes. Thank you so much for supporting independent bookstores and independent bookselling. We couldn't do events like this without this incredible loyalty and support of customers like you. So thank you so much. And then if you have any questions throughout this evening's event, please use the chat box rather than the Q&A box to pose them. We'll have time for questions at any point throughout the evening. So anytime you have a question, just pop that right into the Q&A box. I'm so very pleased to get to introduce James McVey this evening as he joins us to discuss his book, Loon Rangers. Jim grew up in northern Michigan near Sleeping Bear Dunes. He's a freelance writer and the author of 5 books, including Loon Rangers, The Way Home, Essays on the Outside West, and The Wild Upriver and Other Stories. He's traveled widely and written about such places as Napali Coast, the Khumbu Valley of Nepal, the Ison region of Patagonia, and the coral reefs of Cuba. He worked as an outdoor journalist, wildlife biologist, musician, and university professor, and he currently lives in Colorado, where he operates Victory Gardens, a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing local food systems. He'll be interviewed this evening by Elektra Greer, the director of the Nederland Community Library in Nederland, Colorado. Please join me in welcoming them to our screens this evening.
All right, can you all guess which one's the librarian? Shh. Well, hi everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. And first of all, I just have to say I love this cross-pollination of ideas between locally owned bookshops and locally funded small libraries. So this is very exciting. I am a huge fan of Jim McVey's. He is a patron at our library, but more importantly, someone that we are very proud to be able to call a local author. Local author does not mean he writes only about local things, although there's plenty in our community to write about in loony Nederland, Colorado at 8236 feet. So we're going to be talking today about his book. And before we start, just a couple quick things. Absolutely, we love to be interrupted. We love questions through Q&A. We want to keep this as dynamic as possible. We recognize that some of you are here live watching it, and some of you will be watching it later as a recording. But please, at any time, put some questions in the chat box because we want to be sure that this goes in the direction that most interests you. We are aware that not all of you will have finished the book yet. So we're going to try to avoid those spoilers, but as with any great read, it's really, the plot's irrelevant. It's about the themes. It's about the characters. So I don't think we have to worry about that. So this is a wonderful novel that's incredibly rich and complex. And there's so many angles and approaches to take, but I'm going to be really nice to Jim and start with a softball. So let's just jump right in. So Jim, I happen to know that you yourself were part of the Loon survey in the Northern Adirondacks in 1984. So if you wouldn't mind, could you just share your relationship between your personal experiences on the Loon survey and the experiences of Miles, who's our narrator?
Yes, well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Elektra, for being part of this. It means a lot. It's very good to be with people of Saratoga Springs and beyond. I had very fond memories of the time I was in Saranac Lake conducting the Loon survey in 1984, the summer of 1984. And the survey, just briefly, was designed to track reproductive success among common loons in the Adirondacks in order for the state to determine its classification either as an endangered species, a threatened species, or a species of special concern. So I, along with a partner, we stayed in a house just outside of Saranac Lake, and we were given a list by the DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation Non-Game Unit, a list of about 120 lakes that we were responsible for. And primarily, we were looking for nests and breeding pairs, but any kind of loon activity or any wildlife activity we saw, we recorded. We were given a bunch of field forms. So we set out on our own schedule and plan to cover all these waterways in the Northern Adirondacks and gather the data that we could. And again, with a specific interest in breeding pairs and their reproductive success throughout the summer, the data that we compiled and the data that was compiled by two other groups elsewhere in the Adirondacks, research groups, survey groups, would then be compared to similar data that was collected years earlier in order to get a sense of that, the reproductive, the population trends, basically. So yeah, so that was it. And like Miles, I kept a journal as well. And so that's about, this is fiction. And I write both fiction and nonfiction. But this story I wanted to frame as fiction, primarily because I wanted to put it in a broader context of these ecological issues are of our day, and specifically climate change and extinction.
And Jim, I just showed them the journal so they would know, as a librarian, we did our research. It is fiction, but it is based on, as you just said, a lot of your own experiences and extrapolating from that. There's clearly a connection between Miles and the loons in the novel. So could you share with us that a little bit?
Sure. Miles is a complicated character. He's kind of this jaded drifter and itinerant worker who has been making his way across the country, just picking up jobs and really without a direction. So, and he eventually lands, and it's kind of it's to fulfill some community service. He lands on this this survey, this loon survey, and he maybe I'll talk a little bit about his character right off. He's kind of this freewheeling, fun-loving, or kind of a roustabout, very independent, but he does have a code of sorts with these old school values of, I say, loyalty, honesty, and justice. And he, he's very independent to a fault. He often finds, and his behavior sometimes just gets him in trouble. And for instance, in the novel, you'll see that very early on he gets into trouble just because of these behaviors that are kind of instinctual. Well, as he begins this loon survey, he begins to, out of necessity, he has to do some research on loons, and he begins to find some parallels with himself. And over time, he develops this affinity and even begins to identify with the loon. And I'll just point out a couple ways that happens. Number one is camouflage. I'll talk about the plumage, loon plumage, in a minute. But it's set in the 1980s, and so there's an underlying his character is a bit of disillusionment and even despair. He feels somewhat alienated from the mainstream culture and society, and at one point or another, he compares himself to the loon in terms of they're both under the gun, not literally so much, but he walks the shadows at night, and in a way it's to sort of avoid the crosshairs. Again, not of a gun, but maybe the target of a overly consumerist society. He's not clear himself about it. So he begins to, camouflage, that makes sense to me. And then as it develops further, he finds that the loon is a lot of its behavior, which has been developing and evolving for millions of years. The common loon is it comes from one of the oldest bird lineages on the planet, 65 million years. But a lot of those behaviors have been rendered inappropriate in the modern world, and he again identifies with that, especially when he gets in trouble with the law. For example, if he's from this old school, he's from the Colorado mountains and this old school culture. Well, fist fights are just part of the way that men kind of work out their conflicts, and then once it's over, it's over. But he gets into trouble with that, especially when he comes east. And I'm going to point out one of these inappropriate behaviors common among loons, and that I discovered when I was on the survey, and that is from the sky, a loon will, as the loon flies above a forest, it will look down and see a wet asphalt road and think that it's a river. So it will, a waterway of some sort, you know, from a recent rainfall or something, it's black asphalt, and it will try to land on that thinking it's water. Of course it's a road. And because of the position of its legs, which is directly goes out the back of the body, it cannot walk on land. So it's, you know, and there is a scene in the book that describes the situation. And so in a way it's kind of humorous, but on the other hand, it's tragic, because this is the kind of both Miles and the loon are confronted with this problem of these behaviors, these almost instinctual behaviors that have been rendered inappropriate in the modern industrial world, for lack of a better term. So
I'll interject that was part of the book that, for whatever reason, really resonated with me. Very poignantly,
and it is
very
sad.
Poignantly made me think about that.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking, you know. Once you consider all the other challenges that are caused, you know, man-made challenges that the loon and other wildlife has to.
Right. I first thought of it in terms, of course, of the loon and the ecology and the animals, and then I started thinking about it as a human, and then I started thinking about it in terms of technology and all the behaviors at my age that I feel have become inappropriate for where we live, and it lends itself to a lot of thought on that. So I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, so he does. You know, it was important for me to try to establish some kind of emotional undercurrent in this novel, and so a lot of that has to do with this kind of sympathetic look at loons as these sentient beings, and especially in light of the fact that they've been around. I mean, they call it the modern common loon, that's been around for 35 million years.
And for those listening, say that number again, because I didn't know, and I was shocked.
Well, the common loon is what they call the modern common loon. Last I've researched this, is 35 million years old as a species. It comes from a bird lineage that is 65 million years old, making it one of the oldest bird species and lineages on the planet.
So I'm going to just jump, because one of the things I found really compelling was that whole idea of human history and human historical time versus geological time.
Right.
So maybe talk a little bit about how you explored that, because that was something for me that really stuck with me.
Well, a great point. As he's doing this research on loons, it's forcing him to expand his sense of time beyond just human historical time to include which I'll call deep time. And with deep time, I mean, some people will refer to that as geologic time, planetary history. Also, there's a sense of he begins to come across these indigenous stories, including creation stories. And for instance, there's one from the Cree, and it tells one of its interpretations of the whale, the loon whale, is this haunting call of a fallen warrior who is caught between worlds. He's not given entry into the next world. So, and this fallen warrior who is caught between worlds must wander without a home, without a place. And that resonates very much with Miles, because that sheds some light on his own situation personally, but a lot of that situation, again, I will attribute to the culture and the society in which he lives. And this is in 1980s America. And I'll characterize it somewhat as somewhat, consumerist and materialistic. So, and that's a further source of alienation for him personally.
Well, I will admit that I went and did a lot of YouTube Googling and all the loon calls after the Indigenous story. Now I see they're so haunting. So,
and I'll just add one more point about that the issue of time, then that allows him, so as his sense of time expands into deep time, then that makes him, the caretaker of the house where they're staying is this kind of a doomsayer of sorts, who he's constantly bringing up these bulletins of all these ecological problems and changes that are happening on the planet in as early as the 1980s, including global warming and extinction. And at first, Miles dismisses him as kind of just a crazy guy, as do most of the people in town. But then he begins now, through this sense of expanded time, to begin to understand, to put things like climate change and mass extinction into some kind of context of planetary history. So,
I thought that was really profound. Okay, this is the librarian literary question, but the book does tend to seem to read like allegory. So could you shed light a little bit on the relationship between Miles and Annie in that context?
Yeah, and this was really a big part of the challenge. This was my first novel, and I've written a collection of short stories before, but this is a little bit different animal because it's so big. And with short stories that form, things begin to kind of focus in. Whereas in a novel, it's the opposite, where the material, the characters, the themes all begin to expand outward to be much bigger vision. And this was a personal issue that I have kind of been wrestling with. And that is basically, how does this guy, this kind of, again, this jaded drifter, who is so independent, and he lands on this common survey or common loon survey because he has gotten in some scrape with the law, and this was his penalty or his sentences, his community service. But the magistrate says he means well. He's a tough personality, but he means well. Well, how do you get from that to someone who appears to be, at the end of the novel, a dedicated conservationist who is willing to go that step that Annie herself has taken her whole life, and to become even active in that kind of conservation character. So, and this is where, it was, it's kind of like what Holden Caulfield meets Jane Goodall, I mean, I always thought it was
that should have been your blurb.
Put them together, see what happens. And, for a fiction to work, you've got to give the space of the characters to let them be who they're going to be, to fulfill their destinies, if you will, and really to meet their characters.
Did you have the end in mind? Not telling people what the end is.
No, I didn't.
Did you have the end in mind when you started?
No, I didn't necessarily. I didn't. I had a couple things in mind that I wanted to accomplish, and this was, for a long time I was like, well, they have to sort of get to know each other and see where this goes a little bit. I think they both ultimately, because there is, especially initially, there's conflict, because she is this dedicated conservationist. She worked, she at one point she was an activist doing these direct actions, including the Soviet whaling ships interfering with those hunts. if people are old enough to remember, you know, freeing dolphins from tuna nets.
I hope we have a few on here that can remember.
Yeah, so I mean that eco activism really did develop and evolve over time into Earth First and other incarnations. But nonetheless, she is, and we give it some backstory of her early life and how she came to be like this. But she is very consistent. She has made up her mind what is important in this world and what she believes in wholeheartedly. And there's a nice conversation between them two that offers some kind of truce, at least early in the novel. And then I think as time goes on, he changes, and that's the part you want to see about a protagonist, the change they undergo. And so I try to trace those various stages of his changing to become who he is at the end.
So something that I kept thinking about was why you you could have put the story in 2020 or 23. You chose to keep it at the experiences that you had, you know, grounded in the 1980s, although of course all the topics are very relevant. Did you think about doing it at another time, or did you decide you really wanted to have the setting then, and why did you go with that?
I mean, first of all, I had all these detailed notes from my journal, and and that was, I wanted to be true to that, and so I go, well, you know, I'm thinking, well, yes, it'd be easier to set it in a different time period, more recent time period. But then I start thinking about it, and I go, well, this is kind of interesting, this dynamic. In part, it made it a little bit more challenging because I had to go back and just, you know, do a little research about what were some of the main environmental issues in the 1980s. What did people wear? What was the technology? All these things to be true to that time period. But, you know, at that time, you know, what were the big issues, especially in the Adirondacks, was acid rain. And then, you know, the ozone holes at the poles in Antarctica, especially. And also, too, James Hansen had testified before Congress about global warming in 1984. Also, too, the novel 1984, and that makes its way into Loon Rangers a bit, in which, you know, it's sort of a science fiction about a look ahead, a futuristic novel. And so I began to think, well, this is kind of interesting, this playing around with different time periods. And so I said, is there a way to take advantage of this? And I thought so, because really this is, you know, the 1970s was a very big decade in terms of environmental consciousness in this country. A lot of important legislation got passed in the 1970s, including the Endangered Species Act, either late 70s or early 80s, I can't remember which. But so if, you know, back then, if, you know, our doomsayer caretaker is talking about acid rain and ozone holes, then, well, that's only, and just the threats these pose going forward into history. Well, now we're at a period where climate change, climate chaos is being gradually understood as an existential threat to human civilization as we know it. Likewise, back in the 1980s, you know, you had these like whales, the golden toad, I think the two-toed woodpecker. I mean, these were sort of, and then there was, I think, the white rhino in Africa. These were charismatic species that were endangered, on their way to becoming perhaps extinct. And so extinction was an issue. We knew about this. But then, you know, fast forward 40, 50 years, and here we are entering the 6th great mass extinction event in the history of the planet, and it's due to our activities, our presence, man. So I mean, Jim, if anything, it's you know, these are pressing concerns, and frankly, for me personally, these are the sort of the burning issues of our time for me.
Yeah, we're going to come back a little bit. Obviously, You know, it's a novel about loss and the climate crisis, but we did have a question. So, were you interested in and knowledgeable about loons before you yourself got involved in the survey in the 80s?
No, not too much. I mean, I grew up in northern Michigan, and there were common loons there, and I would see them. But I didn't give that much thought. I was familiar with the whale, but and I would see them out on the lake. But they're so striking, their plumage and these ruby red eyes. I mean, it's like something from another planet. And the plumage, I'll talk about that. I mean, so that only made it more intriguing for me the more I got to do research on loons while I was on the survey in 1984. And just what a remarkable story this bird has. And the plumage, for one, is that Miles initially responds to is that it is designed for survival purposes in terms of camouflage, where you get the checkerboard, black and white checkerboard pattern in the summer plumage. And that is it serves a camouflage purpose to sort of blend in with the lake, the sunlight that's fractured and glittering on the lake surface. We all know this in a late afternoon summer, and the sparkling light on the lake, and that's hence the checkerboard pattern, the black and white of a loon. And even the wild, bizarre necklace pattern serves to mimic a V-wake as a bird swims through water. So it's just, and then they have these solid bones, as opposed to most birds have hollow bones. And with the solid bones, it gives them like perfect buoyancy on the water. So all they have to do is press their wings in a little bit, and they begin to sink. Allows them to reach depths of 250 feet below water. They're strictly pretty much a fish eater. They migrate, and they spend a lot of times. The birds in the northeastern part of the country, that's all were the last remaining breeding ground or habitation for loons, common loons. They'll migrate down to like Chesapeake Bay and even to the Gulf of Mexico off of Florida, and where they stay the whole winter on water, pretty much on water exclusively, and they molt, and their feather patterns become pretty much a drab brown gray. Even the color of their eyes change to brown.
Oh,
and
by the way, I can't remember, why are they the red? I know you explained, I think. Why are they that red?
I don't know.
So if anybody ever has flown into Denver International Airport, we have an interesting public art piece of a devil horse with red shining eyes. It's a loon horse. So they don't know why they're that color.
But they do have anywhere between 18,000 and 20,000 feathers, each bird. So it's remarkable, and how they stay warm and under those conditions, and how they're able to survive. But their story goes on. And one of the most interesting parts about it is their complex communication system. There's 4 basic calls, and anywhere from 25 variations on those 4 basic calls that have been identified to have specific meanings.
Did you all have to be able to make different calls? I don't know. That's kind of a random question, but.
Well, no,
when you were surveying, were you supposed to be completely?
Well, we had to go. So these research forms we had to fill out required that we go and we take these measurements of water depth from the nest. The nest will always be on the edge of the water because they can't really walk, and they need a deep water access point. So the lake levels begin to, it was a little bit much because we would invariably scare the adult off the nest. The other adult would be out in the open water and doing these stress calls to warn the other adult sitting on the nest. And so eventually, as we approach, we knew we would be close, and then usually they're on islands because a lot of the natural predators are going to be like raccoons and other large mammals, not usually found on these smaller islands. And as we would round an island, say leeward side, you typically very quietly, the adult would slip off the nest and dive. And once in just perfectly calm water, you could see it dive right under the canoe.
Oh, wow.
And it was like looking at it, it's just a perfect image of this bird flying under there or swimming. And so they were, the calls. We heard the tremolo, the wail at night, especially. That means the adults are trying to locate one another typically.
Oh. And
the yodel, which is the kind of the crazy, crazy like a loon, because some of the calls are like the insane laughter of someone who's from someone. So a human. So it's just so many things are so fascinating about the bird.
I'm going to see if I had a couple little videos pulled up. Let's see if we can at least hear a little bit. There's a little break here.
That would be the tremolo, I believe. That's a bit of an alarm. It's been so long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's one I like too.
You could hear the whale in there.
This is so forlorn. That's the one I think of. Now I know the story behind it. It's
especially at night you hear that.
So they're doing like an echolocation, trying to find one another kind of thing?
Yeah, it's usually two adults trying to find each other's location or keep tabs. They keep tabs on one another. Oh. It's a pair, but it doesn't have to be paired. There are single adults out there, and they're
mate for life? Did I remember that?
Yes, they do mate for life as long as they're reproductively successful. That's what's believed. But there are solo males out there, but the breeding pair will be very territorial, and they'll require at least somewhere like a square mile as far as its territory with its nest. But there are, over the course of the summer, you'd notice there are these other like solo birds flying over, and they would kind of talk to one another as one's flying and one's in the water. And it was pretty cool.
Wow.
We sort of got to know, okay, that one kind of lives over on that lake, and it's very close to this other one, and they're neighbors.
Was there something about the lakes? Like they think that they named the lakes, that they used language somehow or calling?
Yeah, and there's still ongoing research about this. Their communication system is still not fully understood, but they do believe that, well, first of all, the yodel call is used only by males, and that's territorial. But that call will change if the male is for some reason relocated to a different lake. And it's a name, if you will. And so the new call is associated with a new place. And there was some research back, years ago, of someone who found that a male yodel would be a certain call, a yodel call would be specific to a specific lake, a specific place. And it would be used by different birds, but only in that specific place.
So different birds would make that same call for that. So it was
different birds would use the same call on that specific.
Wow.
They would not use it anywhere else. So it's as though it plays into kind of the territorial theme, because it's okay. This call is specific to this place. Place becomes a very important theme in the novel. There's that old saying, every place for everything, everything in its place. And at the beginning of the novel, Miles is going to dismiss that. And it's unclear whether or not he subscribes to that by the end. It doesn't appear to be. But anyway, I leave that kind of ambiguous or ambivalent. So but I mean, as the loon is getting displaced from its habitat due to a variety of threats, almost all of which are man-made, caused by man, Miles feels that same kind of sense of rootlessness, and like the fallen warrior who is destined to wander without a home, without a place. So, and that it's sort of, you know, that's part of our American story as well, that uprootedness. Yeah, so.
I mean, I know Loon Rangers, it won a Prison Prize, I believe, for climate literature. So, okay, don't depress us too much. But can you tie the book in? I mean, there's very clearly talking about climate crises and, you know.
Yeah, you know, it was.
And maybe give us a little sense of, you know, looking back and now where we are and things like that.
Yeah, you know, there's really not a lot of attention to climate or global warming, as it was called back then. It's just one of a number of these doomsday scenarios that the caretaker keeps floating. And, you know, more people were more concerned, obviously, with acid rain at that point. And that was for the whole sort of greater ecosystem up there, because the fish would not be able to, I mean, there were dead lakes, like the lakes that had no fish. And I do remember a sort of a wildlife biologist up there telling me, yeah, that I know that lake is dead and there are people fishing on it. I don't know whether to laugh or cry, you know.
Yeah.
But what happens by the end, this is, as you mentioned earlier, this is a story of loss. And part of that, well, he is going to come to some understanding, Miles, and his change, ultimately, that the world he's living in is all but gone. And it you know, because of the trends that are already underway, including global warming and extinction, which have only become much more accelerated as time has gone on. And so there's a sense there where this world that I'm experiencing now is doomed, it's gone. And the way, and I've, you know, there's the way I can envision that is that the world that human beings have called home for thousands of years, the Holocene, with a pretty steady, consistent climate regime, made it so possible for us to thrive as a species. And that's been our home. And, you know, it's pretty clear, I think, at this point now that we're out of the Holocene, we're into what people call the Anthropocene, which is already underway. I would think in terms of its consequences, we're seeing it every year with increased flooding and wildfires, et cetera, acidification, oceans, I mean, on and on and on. So there's a sense there that of loss, that we're really sort of losing the home humans are as a species, that we're losing the world that we have known as home for thousands and thousands of years. So and it becomes, you know, if you really let it sink in, I mean, that's go back to the earlier point. I wanted this to be a sort of an emotional undercurrent. I don't know if I've achieved that, but I mean, that sense of loss, it's emotional, but it's also moral and ethical from my standpoint. And it really raises questions. I mean, he has a rant at the end of the novel, and I won't go into it in too much detail, but we're kind of caught. I mean, this gets back to a little bit of like the doublethink of the novel 1984. We're caught in this situation where we know that what we're doing, what we're participating in and day out, our economy is leading to these disasters, and ultimately going to be a threat to not only ourselves, but all these other species and ecosystems, planetary systems, natural systems. And yet we do that each day. We get in the car and we go to work, and we're going to work for whatever, I mean, Martin Marietta here in Denver. I mean, weapons designers and builders and
Jim, my job is to not depress everyone. So give us the sequel.
So
what does Miles do in the sequel? We're all American Disneyfied. Give us a good.
It does, but it does.
Save the day.
No, I can't. Not giving away any secrets.
Okay.
I mean, how the book ends or anything, but it is.
If there were a sequel, though.
Do a little bit of a dilemma on an individual basis. Well, what do I do? What do I do? Knowing this, I'm contributing to this, and what do I do? I have to pay bills, but I urgently want to do something that get my life in line with the reality on the ground. And that's the challenge.
Since clearly this book is so close to many of your own processes and thoughts on these. Was the process of writing it, was it cathartic? Did it bring you also new perspectives, hope? Like, what was that process, and being able to distance yourself from it too, because you didn't want it does not read as, some didactic scourge.
No, I wanted to be true to, and this is where, Annie's character, she does have this kind of worldview that is positive, and there's hope, and it is active. I mean, she's put her life in line with these things. He has not, but he's as he becomes closer to her, then it's complicated for him, but he begins to see a way out of his own kind of cage that he has in a way built for himself because of his code and so forth. But I did want to be kind of honest and true about the sort of the frustration and even the anger, or as some call it, sacred rage. I think Terry Tempest Williams has used that term, sacred rage, that we feel as we witness what's happening to the biosphere over time. And we're still on that track. We're not anywhere close to turning it around. So I wanted to be sort of honest about that, and I myself get frustrated and angry at that. So that and it's not necessarily a negative emotion, but then you got to go beyond that, I think, and that's the challenge. I really liked seeing the characters kind of emerge and stand up on the page, and then really it kind of came naturally. You just, as a writer, once you get something going, you got to take a step back and let them be, and then you draw from all kinds of memories and just things you've heard about, and to really fill out their characters. A lot of the there's humor in it, and I like that. There's this kind of there's this backwoods mentality of Miles growing up in Nederland back in the 70s, which is a pretty wild town where we live today. And so that was fun, and then I could just recall so many different things. And but it was, it's a novel, and it, beginnings and endings are hard, and so
in novels and in life,
and you're juggling a lot of balls as a writer. You're wanting to do a lot of different things, but you have to make it feel organic.
And we had a question: did you visit the Adirondacks while writing the book, or since its publication? And if you did you notice much changes since your time there as the survey?
Yeah, I was up last fall. I was up at the Adirondack Loon Conservation Center in Saranac Lake to do a presentation. Great little museum. I recommend it highly if you're ever up in Saranac Lake, the town. Stop in. They have great information. They organize outings. They publish professional papers. They're just up to date on all the issues. And Saranac Lake is no longer really it still has that rough and tumble kind of working class quality to it, as opposed to Lake Placid down the road. But it, there's coffee shops and nice craft beer places, and so it's changing a bit, but not really its quality. The area is still beautiful and the same. And they, I got up to date a little bit of more of the current threats, climate change, some things there, that for instance, they're seeing more torrential downpours, and that water level fluctuations are always a problem with, they can flood a nest, and if it cools off the egg won't produce.
So how are the loons doing right now?
Well, all I can say is that back in 1984, they were classified as a species of special concern, and that classification remains the same today. So I think both good and bad. I mean, the shoreline development, lead poisoning from fishing lures, fishing line entanglement, pollution, mercury from the air, all these things are threats in addition to the natural predatory threats. So they've been under the gun for a long time, since the arrival of white Americans, and especially, but they're very adaptive. There was once back when the first tourists arrived, they go to some of these high-end camps in the backcountry. They would take steamboats to get there, and the tourists along the railings of the boats would just open fire on loons indiscriminately. That's just what they did. But very quickly, loons learned this technique of staying underwater and coming up for air, only to expose their mouths in air and get a gulp of air and go back down.
That's really great.
Yeah. So
that's really great.
Yeah, yeah, so that's just part of the story. But the other thing too, they're coming back earlier in the springtime, and that makes them a little bit vulnerable to quick freezes, which then, water for them, open water is their whole source of survival. That's where their food is. That's where their protection is. And so, we'll see, but at least there's that museum, that center there is very important in terms of raising consciousness. I remember back in the day, power boats and jet skis and everything. They go there like loons are our playthings, and that's just hopefully the consciousness overall is changing a bit.
I think we just have a couple more minutes. I don't know, Rachel, if there are any other questions. Or if Jim, I've seen James, I just saw that. You're not a James, you're a Jim. If Jim wants to wrap up with any last thoughts, or since local bookshop, we always want to hear what else our authors are reading. So anything else you can recommend? I'm sure, Rachel, everyone on has read Braiding Sweetgrass. He and I both agree that is an all-time favorite. But any other books or thoughts or ideas?
Is that open for anybody?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, I'll say one thing about Braiding Sweetgrass. I consider it a major work, and for years, I taught literature, especially Western literature, and with a special look at nature books, especially nonfiction and written in the last 50 years. And so I put this right up there with Abbey's Desert Solitaire, Thoreau's Walden, as a major work. And it's interesting. She's I think she's from that area, yeah, but she teaches at SUNY ESF, and I went there years ago back in the 80s, and that's how I got this job on the Loon Survey back in '84 through the school there at ESF. So I feel that's pretty cool. But I mean, her ability to connect ancient indigenous wisdom with science, especially in ecological sciences, it's so vital. It's so vital to bring that reconciliation to the fore.
Oh, I just saw we're gonna have to watch your interview with her. Okay. Yay.
Oh, excellent.
Great.
Yeah, the major work.
Days of the week.
I'm sorry for disappearing for a moment. I'm in the store and there's an overhead announcement going on behind me. So that's why. But yes, Robin Wall Kimmerer was the interviewer in a wonderful virtual event that we did a few years ago for the book Losing Eden. And it was a really memorable, lovely event. And Braiding Sweetgrass is an all-time bookseller favorite, all-time Northshire bestseller.
Oh, that's great.
Yes, one that we've had a lot of love for.
Oh, so, that's wonderful.
Yes. We are sadly just about out of time. And I have not gotten any more questions from the audience. So I think this is probably a fairly good place to wrap up. But Jim and Elektra, thank you both so much for taking the time to talk this evening. This has been really lovely and fascinating.
All right. We hope to see some of you out here, and we'll be back out over there.
Yes. And audience members, you can find Loon Rangers at northshire.com, as well as check out the list of other upcoming events there. Have a great night, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.
All right.
Thank
take
you.
care. Bye-bye.